All right, welcome back. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today is Stacey Bishop. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Well, thanks so much for doing this. So Stacey's a venture capitalist. She is at Scale Venture Partners. She's done quite a bit, but she's a board member, or has been a board member at companies like Lever, Demandbase, HubSpot, Exact Target. There was a ton more that I couldn't even write down. As I figure it, Scale has something like $1 billion under management. And most interestingly to me, as I was preparing, you went to Columbia and Michigan, which is not your typical venture capital package.
Because I didn't go to Stanford?
Or Harvard.
Yeah, or Harvard.
Princeton,
no.
Or Princeton undergrad.
Yeah, you're right. I know. Actually, though, surprisingly, I think I saw numbers and those two schools are kind of up there. But yes, it's not in the norm of what you typically see of the venture capitalists.
I went to North, and I talked to a lot of minorities and people who are kind of trying to break into venture capital, and they see it a lot. Like they note, they think it's kind of funny that everyone's gone to like Harvard. We think it's really diverse because like, oh, it's Harvard and Princeton and Stanford.
Right.
I went to Northwestern, and that's like, there's like 5 of us in Silicon Valley, something like that.
Got it. Well, one thing I'll add to that. So I'm a part of an organization called allraise.org.
Yep.
And what Allraise does is it's supposed to bring in more people into venture capital. And so if people go to that website, allraise.org, there's actually a newsletter you can sign up for that we present job opportunities. Because the concern is that it does become this like insulated network where somebody goes to Harvard Business School and then they have they're an alum, and then they, new students interview with them, and it becomes this whole cycle. Or Stanford, obviously, given its, proximity to, that it's in Silicon Valley, and it's supposed to help open up all those opportunities. And it's particularly for women and underrepresented minorities is what the people who are generally on the list, the email list, but it's a great place to go look. And there's lots of other initiatives that Allraise does, but that's one. So people who are interested in getting into the industry, go there and sign up for the newsletter.
It is interesting. I've talked to a lot of people about it, and you do get these things where it's like, well, a venture firm, if it's like 2 or 3 people, it's you and your life partner in business or whatever. And it turns out that, for example, when they started, Andreessen and Horowitz are 2 men, but they're like also like life partners. So you don't say, hey, Mark Andreessen, why didn't you hire a woman or a person of color? And he subsequently, of course, they have. Right. But when it was just the 2 of them, of course, that was the 2 of them.
Well, especially in venture, because you're in it for the long haul. It's not like a company where people cycle through, 2, 3, 4 years. I've been at Scale for 21 years. Yeah. So you're at a place a long time. So people are very careful about who they pick. And you bring up a good point. Like Andreessen and Horowitz, they'd worked together. So they knew that they already got along. And that's a very important thing, because they say it's like a business marriage. And you have to make sure that you get along. And so then I think you have this propensity to sort of pick people maybe who are like you.
Yeah.
And that's what you're used to. So.
But there is a little bit of unconsciousness as I listen to a lot of these podcasts, like the number of people who, when a venture capitalist gets interviewed, the white guy venture capitalist, how did you come to be in venture capital? And they never say, oh, since I was a kid. It's always like, I fell into it, which is like, if you think about what a lovely job it is and how few people on the planet have this job, it's not that it's offensive, but it's a little bit like, you should be a little bit conscious of you fell into it, not from the housing project in Chicago. You fell into it from your Stanford roommate's dad who founded, the famous firm.
Right. That could be. Well, it's also like, I didn't know about the venture capital industry until I went to business school. So I think it's also just a lack of awareness of what it is. I suppose there's more awareness now than there was 25 years ago, but
how did you figure it out? How did you figure out venture capital? You're working in M&A, which was a very, kind of the cliche MBA thing to do, and a lot more M&A people in the world than venture people in the world. What was it like when you kind of came into how did you find this world?
Well, I did take a couple of classes at Columbia Business School. So that first exposed me to, okay, what is this venture thing? And I liked it. It kind of brought together what I really liked about the industry, where there's numbers like you, and I'm very much a numbers kind of person, but then you're thinking about industries and people, and it's you have to bring together a lot of different disparate data to kind of figure out like what to invest in. And I was in that opportunistic moment though, where I was working for Bank of America in the M&A group, and they also had a venture arm that had an opportunity, and it was supposed to be like a 1-year kind of job as an associate to help them out and help them. At the time they had a fairly small staff and they just needed help. So I thought, all right, I'll do this for a year, because I thought I would go work for a company. And what a better way to go work for a company than to work for a venture firm first, to help you learn how to assess what company to go work for. So I thought it was going to be a 1-year thing. And then 1 year turned into 2 years. And then here we are.
And then Scale is the same thing. It just came out of
spun out of the Bank of America, exactly, in 2006. And Bank of America is no longer involved with us and hasn't been since then. But that was kind of the predecessor to giving us our start.
So at that time when you were, beginning venture capitalist, what was it like? What was it like? Like, what was the landscape? Because I've talked to people and women who've been in venture capital all different phases. And, Maha Ibrahim and people early on sort of had this sort of sanguine view of like, oh, boys will be boys kind of thing. And then later on, people are more like, we got some problems we need to fix. To the people I talk who are just entering, like Brianne Kimmel and Monique Woodard, who were pretty forward in how they're thinking about people in venture capital.
Yeah. And I think, when I first started, and I started around the time Maha started, and I met her way back then, there weren't very many of us. So you just, as kind of a woman in venture, you just sort of heads down, did your job, just focused on, trying to get ahead and do the right thing. And I think the most eye-opening thing, and this is why I don't mean to make this commercial for All Raise, but when All Raise started, it changed the dynamic because it suddenly brought all the women together. And even though we had all been kind of working side by side, there were so few of us that there was a little bit of getting together, but not like there is now. Now there's kind of this whole sort of network. And so I think it's had a change in the industry. And then obviously it's just helped push and eliminate the bad behavior that has occurred. So I feel like, you had the Justin callback situation a few years ago and how awful that was. And that's just like, now it's just completely unacceptable. Whereas I think it was, not saying it was ever acceptable, but it was sort of brushed under the rug.
Yeah, I've been surprised by the stories. I had Ellen Powell on, who talked pretty openly about her experiences at the various firms. And Kleiner Perkins was such an interesting one because they had all the women. Like, I've talked to Treva Solo and to Ellen Powell, not Aileen yet, but Will at some point, who was key in forming All Raise, I think.
She was, absolutely. She was the main catalyst.
They had all the great, Mary Meeker and all these women who are now all have their own firms.
They do. I know.
They're doing spectacularly well. What was the what was venture investing like? Was it, I have this image of it being like 5 companies dividing up all the, making decisions, where there's hundreds of firms now. There were relatively few at the time.
Well, I would say where there's hundreds of firms now, as I say, where it's really exploded in terms of the number of firms, it's at that seed level, that's early stage. But I would say on the later stage side, the number of firms hasn't increased significantly. It's a lot of the same people that it was, say, 20 years ago. So I don't think that that's dramatically changed. But the explosion, in my point of view, has happened on the seed side. And also you've had some of the hedge funds kind of coming down into venture a bit. So you have these other asset classes also getting involved in venture, but kind of the core venture is pretty similar.
Yeah. And now what of that? You say some hedge funds coming in. It seems to me like every hedge fund seems to be thinking that they can do a pretty good job of late stage capital.
Well, I should clarify that point, because I think the hedge funds coming in at the earlier stage, I think hedge funds have certainly been there at the later stage. And because private companies are going public much later. So in order for them to get the returns they need, they have to start coming into the private markets, but they're often showing up the late stage, but now we're seeing them much earlier. And so that's probably been the change. And that's been over the last several years. But
now, do they have the ability? I mean, you've done this, you know how to do it. Do the hedge funds, is it really that easy? Just come in and, start plunking down $50 to $100 million checks?
It has been in this market because like we've been in a bull market and everybody looks smart right now.
Right.
Most people look smart right now because most things have gone up. Though that being said, I think one of the main reasons for that is just the impact of this recurring revenue model. And, a lot of people say it's SaaS, but I'll just say it's recurring revenue because it's almost in everything we look at. And it just gives so much more predictability. And so therefore, I think public markets are giving so much more value to it. So you've kind of seen this, tick up. So yeah, right now everybody looks super smart, but we all wonder, like, will it change and what will happen? And
Right.
it looks so far so good post-election because that was the one next big worry, but you never know.
Yeah, and I think there've been a couple changes over time that I've noticed. That, you kind of have the people trying to get rich in New York, investment bankers, and at some point, $10 million a year, 20, whatever ridiculous amounts of money they make, at some point they look to Mark Zuckerberg or somebody like that, and they're like, well, I don't make $30 billion doing what I do. Like the magnitude of things. Or if you look at the company side, maybe 20 years ago, I don't know what a big exit would be. Maybe 500 million would be pretty cool.
Yeah, well, I was going to point to more of that. And I think even we as a firm sort of underestimated how big companies could get, because that's been sort of the dramatic change is like, and I wish I had more of the stats on at the tip of my fingers, but, we track all the venture exits over time. And, 10 years ago, there were just a handful of companies that were kind of the $1 billion exit for venture. And now that's, that like a given fund will have 5 or 6 out of 20 companies that will be $1 billion exits. And it's just these companies can get really big. And that was something that we just hadn't really grasped that many years ago.
I talked to somebody who worked at one of the big venture firms, and somehow his firm had a stake in the China version of their firm. And he had nothing to do with China, but they had a little stake in the Chinese piece. And he was like, every few months there'd be some $10 billion exit of something you'd never heard of in China. And he'd get some payout from it.
Yeah, we don't do investments in China, so I don't know. But yeah, you do hear about those. I mean, look, China's huge, and so a lot of these companies come out and can sell to this giant market. But I'm not that familiar with that market. But I think it's even now. I mean, we had a company go public in September called JFrog, and it's like I'd have to look. It's like a $5 or $6 billion market cap. Right. Most people haven't even heard of the company. Right. But 10 years ago, if you had a $5 or $6 billion exit, everybody would have known about it. But now it's like, they're just, and it's funny, they went public the week Snowflake went public. So right. They were just like way under the radar because Snowflake was, the biggest venture exit of all time. But hey, we'll take JFrog. They're doing great.
No, there's kind of famous, I don't know if it's apocryphal, but a story about Benchmark that apparently the day that Duolingo went public, which I think was one of their investments, for a couple $1 billion, they didn't even mention it, like at the partners meeting, because it wasn't, Uber, which was $80 billion.
Oh, right.
I don't know if that's true, but
yeah, I don't know either, but because it was just so small, but like, it was a big exit, but yeah, but I think, but one thing I want to make sure that I point out is these companies are growing large, like their revenue is big. And I mean, we were investors in DocuSign, and it's, I think it's crossed $1 billion in revenue. So it's like they are generating a ton of revenue. There's predictability to that. So I think that's what's attractive to investors.
Well, yeah. And, software scales beautifully and sort of infinitely if it's not, tied to some kind of asset,
Right. And most isn't.
Yeah. And then, I think the thing that now you realize, like, the world it's a world of like billions of people, and things scale to, billions of consumers or hundreds of millions of professionals or tens of millions of businesses.
That's exactly right. Right. And the ability to distribute it over the web has just made it, that it can be so large. And you're seeing, and, this is, we can get into this a little bit, but, we do see these companies that are benefiting from the COVID environment. And I'll put DocuSign in that bucket. We've got another one, Bill.com, that anything that it just takes a sort of manual paper process and automates it and brings it online is seeing a huge benefit.
And what is your sense of that? There was kind of recently a vaccine kind of got announced, and a bunch of these stocks declined. But isn't the thesis? It's not that like COVID's going to be around forever, and therefore you need DocuSign.
Yeah, no, it was funny because I actually had this conversation with one of my colleagues saying, it was just earlier this week that when Pfizer announced, a bunch of those stocks were down. And I thought, it's not like people are going to go back to paper signatures or going to go back to cutting checks if, we have a vaccine and we're all back at work. I mean, maybe there'll be a little bit less Zoom happening. Sure. But that being said, I think Zoom now has become so pervasive. I mean, at the beginning of COVID, it was like, my kid's soccer team is doing Zoom. Yeah. Every one of their classes is doing Zoom. My daughter wants to do Zoom with her girlfriends, and like it's everywhere. And I don't think you can take that back. I think it's going to be a permanent part of, or, I'll use an example, like back to school meetings were all done. You had to be in person. I guarantee going forward now, they'll have a Zoom camera, they'll have their laptop on with a Zoom so that parent who can't go in person can now join the back to school night.
Yeah. The Goldman Sachs had a CFO survey of the Fortune 500. And I think that on average, they said they expected to cut business travel expense by like 70% in the future. Just because they learned, like, look, you don't need to fly across. Sometimes you do, sometimes you got to do it. But you really don't need to fly cross country, stay in a hotel for a 10 o'clock meeting that ends at 11 a.m.
Totally. Or the other thing, I was talking to an entrepreneur just this past week and, asking him, we were talking just a little bit about COVID and fundraising and whatnot. And he said, I love fundraising in this environment because these first meetings, I can do 10 of them in a day. Whereas pre-COVID, I had to go to New York to do 2. And then I had to go to Boston to do 2 more, and then down to DC, and then take a week out to go to California and cover all those firms. And this happens to us. Sometimes within 5 minutes of a meeting, you just realize it's not a fit because it's either the check size or it's the industry, whatever it is, you realize it's not a fit. So it almost feels like in the venture industry, every first meeting should be a 30-minute Zoom to just figure out if it's a match, and then go to the next meeting.
That's absolutely happened in that it used to be, well, you came to my office, you parked, out of respect, we'll sit around for an hour.
Of course.
Yeah, it's just a respect thing. Even after 5 minutes, you realize it's not a fit. You don't get up and walk. Well, I've seen some VCs do it, but you generally don't get up and walk out of the room. But with a Zoom call, after 30 minutes, you can say, hey, great, interesting, probably not our thing, but
Or sometimes it's 15 minutes, but no one's, because the thing is, in that earlier situation, somebody had to get in the car and drive to go see you and take all that time. So out of respect, you don't want to, not spend the time with them. Or the other one too is you'll sometimes get a company introduced to you, and so you feel this obligation. Oh, I should take a meeting because it was a very I know this person really well, and then you find out it's not a fit for whatever reason. It's so that I hope is a change. So I can't say will it be a 70% drop? Maybe, but it will certainly be a drop because I think people will realize that a whole subset of meetings can now be done over Zoom.
And I think there's a whole new tranche of people who were like, I'm never going to learn how to use that technology, who have learned to use the technology. And it ain't not that hard.
Well, and I think the old school way, particularly salespeople, was, I've got to get in and meet the person. I've got to go meet them in person because that's just the way it's done. And I'm going to have a better impact and be able to sell more. And I think everybody's had to adjust and realize that you don't have to do that. That being said, you definitely want to meet people in person. But I think the other important one is, especially meetings with people you already know. Right. There's no reason that you need to do it in person, especially if I think meeting at some point, like when we're making a new investment, though we have done investments in the COVID environment where we've hired someone, and we've also done a handful of investments where we haven't actually met the person. But I will say you will at some point in the process with new investments want to go meet that person.
That's right. Well, how does a company come into your purview? Like if you're putting money into a company, do they hit certain milestones, or have you been tracking them since they were a seed firm, or how does somebody come into your portfolio?
Yeah, it's a mix. And it's funny, of the investments that we do work on, I would say half they come in referred in by maybe the earlier VCs or another entrepreneur. And the other half are we proactively seek out the companies. On the ones that we're proactively seeking out the companies, it's usually because we have a thesis around a market and we think it's an interesting area to invest. And so therefore we're, reaching out to the company to meet with them.
And so how does a founder kind of is there anything somebody could do on the founder side to get your attention or interest, or is it just the case like go be successful and you'll come find them?
Well, what I would say, and I'm always surprised that more companies don't do this, is put the effort into that initial email. I will look at something. If anything that looks like a form letter, I almost ignore it. Anything that's like, "Dear Sir," forget about it. But if somebody's put the effort in to say, look at our website, read a blog post, refer to that blog post, refer to companies in the portfolio, or even just mention, common connections or something like that, find some way to connect with that VC. It's worth the extra 10 minutes of effort to do that and put that into the email, because it'll make you look twice at it. And we as a firm, we actually try to do this where we'll publish blog posts of where we're interested in investing as kind of a call to action to entrepreneurs out there. So if you've done your homework and you see that blog post is out there and you're a company that does that, make sure you mention that.
Right. Is there something that you see over and over again, like a great entrepreneur, or the DNA of a great software company, I guess in your case? Is there something you see that you look for and that you recognize across companies?
Yeah. And in fact, I did a presentation on this a few years ago of kind of the common attributes of some of the companies that have done well. And I think, at the time, the companies were HubSpot, ExactTarget, Box, and DocuSign were the 4 companies. And some of the attributes that I saw, particularly I'm going to point to the CEO, is DocuSign's the exception because they actually had like 5 CEOs before they went public. But the other 4 companies, it was the original founder who'd founded the company. I think one of the most important thing about those Omniture was the 5th one. It was about those founders is they had high self-awareness of what they were good at and what they weren't good at. And they made sure they hired people to help fill in the gaps. And in all cases too, they all had a very loyal exec team. A lot of the executives that were around them. Now, maybe those executives had maybe perhaps changed roles in the time they were at the company, but they stuck with the CEO. So there was a loyalty factor that I saw with those companies. So some of the original team was there at the IPO, right. And I just found that to be really impressive. And then and it also goes to and we're this topic I know is around the Series B, and one of the things I wanted to highlight there is that we're really looking for that CEO's ability to hire great people and bring in really talented people. That's so critical at that stage.
And what skill is that? Is it that they're good to room, or they're good to tell? Like what is it that makes someone good?
It's a self-awareness. It's just knowing yourself and knowing what you're good at and what you're not good at, and then being able to inspire people to believe in whatever you're building and get them to come join you.
Yeah.
It just seems like that's the skill. And one of the important things though that I noticed, and I'll use an example of Brian Halligan at HubSpot. So in board meetings, in the beginning, he would do what was called a chalk talk. And, he'd spend maybe 15, 20, sometimes 30 minutes kind of giving his state of the industry. And then he would literally sit in the back in the corner of the boardroom, and the rest of his team would step in and basically do the rest of the board meeting. And what that showed me is Brian just implicitly trusted his team. Yeah. And he was able to he just knew his people were good. And he's like, they're better at their functional skill. Like my VP of sales knows more about that, what's going on in the sales department than I do. My CFO, whatever it is, he just, and I feel like I see that time and time again. And it's one of the things we test for in diligence, although I will admit it's harder in COVID. We love to go do an onsite with a company and, spend 4 hours. And one of the things I'm kind of looking for is that CEO comfortable with their team? Are they constantly like piping in after that person talks and sort of get the feeling that they're micromanaging the message and the information we get? I want to be able to get, unfettered access to those other executives, because that shows me that the CEO trusts that his or her team.
Now, is it the case with enterprise companies, because it became kind of the gospel for consumer internet companies that you keep the founder? Andreessen Horowitz kind of famously keep that, it's the Mark Zuckerberg, keep him all the way, no matter what.
Yeah.
Is that now an enterprise company goes through phases where you stand up different kinds of sales teams and, structures that are complex.
Right.
Is it the same case for enterprise companies? Or?
I think that it is. That being said, with, going back to those 5 companies, only one, we, had 5 CEOs. But the original founder of the company was still with the company all the way through the IPO. So the original founder was still there. But with the other four, it was the original founder. But like I said, the key thing was, did those original founder CEOs hire good people around them? And if they do, then they can make it all the way. And there's something about the founder's heart and soul being in the company and just really wanting to take the company to the next place. And you want to hang on to that if you can. I mean, that being said, there's plenty of success stories where the new CEO comes in and does take the company to the new level. But in an ideal world, you'd like to keep that founding team in there, but you have to make sure that you've got a really strong executive team surrounding them.
Is there anything the founder can do about executive teams? The issue of, if you bring somebody in who knows how to set up, sophisticated systems like a European African sales organization, that person is also good at politics. Like if you have one talent, you tend to have the other. Or should there be anything you can kind of do about that, so you don't end up with just, a kind of a political regime too early in your company?
What do you mean? Like the culture gets set
the culture gets, like, people are fighting and the sales guys fighting with the product person and
I mean, you're hoping that doesn't happen. And if it does, you've got to kind of figure out where the source of that pain, what's driving it. Because oftentimes you can bring in one executive that sort of changes the dynamic of the management team and changes the culture. And if it's going in the wrong direction, then even if that executive's successful, you may have to remove that executive. Just because you got to want to stay on course for the company and not have someone who's super disruptive.
Yeah, I was talking to I think it was Bob Cagle at Benchmark, and he said it in a very he's like, yeah, sometimes they just take management teams just get off to a bad start and they never get back. Like, you're pulling this guy out and putting that guy in and bringing coaches, and it can be fixed.
Yeah, usually then that's where the problem is probably with the CEO. Like, right. There's kind of this, one of my partners always said this was, if you change out 2 VPs of sales, the next person, and you're still having trouble, the next person to probably go is the CEO.
Yeah.
Because
that's why.
Usually 2 people are not failing at sales. It's usually there's a bigger fundamental problem with the company. But usually when you get companies off on the wrong foot, and I'd be surprised, curious on that question to Bob, did he have any companies that were successful that had those kind of challenges early on?
He did. But he just said, it's lovely when it goes the other way.
Okay.
When it's just clicking and
yes,
it just keeps working, and the CEO just scales from 10 to 30 to 100.
Yeah, it probably means too, whatever those companies were, is that just they so hit the market correctly that it was the market that was just giving them the huge draft. And that's our theory in venture investing, is that they say team. We say market, because markets matter so much more than the team. Though the way we think about it is the market matters first. So you got to get the market right. The best team in the worst market, unless they can find a way to pivot away from it, is not going to work. You can still have a not so good team, but if the market's so good, you can still have a great outcome. If you have a great market and a great team, then it's amazing. But one other comment on that is, we generally think that markets determine outcomes, or determine, if it's going to be a good investment, but sometimes the team is the differential between, is this going to be the number 1 company or the number 2 company in a market? And that's where we've made errors, is we've gotten the market right, but we ended up backing the number 2 player, and the outcome is just dramatically different.
Did you meet the number 1 player and pick the number 2 player?
In one case we did, and it was one of those situations where we did meet the number 1 company, but we felt like it had gotten away from us. The price was just too expensive, and we didn't want to pay $1 billion for that. So we ended up paying $50 million for the other company, or whatever it is. And we should have just paid $1 billion for the good company.
Right.
So in some ways, and that's why you sometimes see this outrageous pricing, is because if people feel like it's the breakaway company, they're willing to sort of pay these outrageous prices even in the private markets.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what Mark Andreessen always says about kind of like at whatever stage, like the A stage, I guess, where he's like, look, a cold company is 10 million, a hot company is $40 million valuation. So fine, it's very different, but the outcome is $4 billion.
It could be. Yeah, exactly. So you're much better off. I know. So you don't want to be cheap at, there's no quote huge discount that you get, before you're better off paying up a little bit to get the right team and the right company going after it. Because I mean, when we look at our errors, I think half were we got the wrong market and half we basically backed the wrong team.
Yeah.
And we weren't able to recover and make the changes we needed to get the company back on track.
Yeah. Well, let me finish with a couple of things. If somebody's coming to you, is there any advice you would give them on how they should be? So they've sent the great email, the company's great. Anything about how they should be pitching you, like communicating with you about their?
Yeah, I mean, you really want them. I mean, you want to feel like you're building some rapport, but you want to hear the story. What's the story of where? And even at we do Series A and Series B. So different than seed, because seed is oftentimes, the pitch deck and the two people. We're almost always looking at it when there's a product already, right, when we're looking closely to invest. So you want to hear the story. And it really does go back to that kind of elevator pitch of, can someone tell me this in the elevator? Like some of our best investments were the most simple tagline, electronic signature, right, cloud storage. I will say on the infrastructure side, it gets a little trickier, like JFrog, that company I mentioned earlier, binary repositories. I mean, it's in terms right, of software development. So that one's a little more complicated, but generally it's fairly simple to understand what the company does.
Yeah. So how are you feeling? Like, what do you see kind of looking forward? I guess I'll ask both, like as a venture investor and then kind of for all raise and women in venture, as we kind of, at some point COVID will be done. At some point, the election will be resolved one way or another if we're not there already. Like, what do you see? What are you looking at as you look across the next 5 or so, 10 years in the venture world?
Yeah, I mean, we still believe there's a ton of opportunity. One of the areas where we're specifically spending time is, what we call cognitive apps. And it's basically where the intelligence is in the application. And the way I'll describe it is, think of Salesforce as a database where we as users have to put the data in. The cognitive apps they're actually pulling the data from, maybe it's a sensor or maybe it's another system, and they're automatically pulling the data in. And oftentimes there's AI in there to help, make it happen. And so like an example would be, or it's bringing automation to something that typically a person did. So it might be a chatbot that's replacing, humans' tasks. And so basically it's the software is intelligent in terms of what it does.
Yeah, that's great. So you're pretty optimistic about the future.
Yeah, I am optimistic about the future. I still think there's opportunity. And I think, these last 8 months or so, even in this COVID environment, has been an interesting period of time. And it's this weird place to be actually from the venture perspective where, the world is in a really tough place and it seems to be getting worse. Well, it is getting worse at the moment. And I think we're headed into a pretty scary territory from the COVID standpoint, given where the numbers are. But the tech industry is doing quite well. And it's the companies are growing and the software, this digital transformation has been significantly accelerated over the past, 8 months.
It's definitely been a crazy time. How do people find you or follow you or hear what you're saying in your blog posts?
You can email me at Stacey@ScaleVP. I don't tweet a lot, but I'm on Twitter, and then ScaleVP on our website.com. We have a blog.
Great. Well, thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Stacey Bishop has been my guest. This is the Something Mushroom podcast. I'll talk to you next time.